I've had a number of viewers asking me if I wouldn't shoot some videos on Ludwig Wittgenstein, and specifically on two of his works, one emblematic of his early phase, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and the other taken to be sort of the best expression of his mature work, where he actually repudiated the Tractatus, the Philosophical Investigations. And I will shoot videos on those, although there's going to be some delay because I have some other projects in the workings right now. But what I wanted to do with this video is to talk about my own philosophical development and what I call my Wittgenstinian phase. Because there was a time where I was really captivated by Wittgenstein and reading him and thinking about him a good portion of the time. It was not quite as long as, what I would call my Sartrean or Nietzschean phases. And in some ways it didn't run quite as deep for reasons that I'll talk about a little bit later on in the video when I talk about why I got out of Wittgenstein. But I will just say this, what I was getting into and why I was attracted to Wittgenstein, I found some very interesting material for pondering and reflecting in his works, but then I also found that a lot of other people were doing similar type of work and sometimes doing it quite a bit better in ways that were more informed, in ways that you might say had greater potential for doing something with it. So that's why I ended up leaving Wittgenstein behind, but I did go through a period where I really was in a phase where I was trying to see everything through the lens of Wittgenstein. And that was mostly in graduate school, and it was early on in graduate school, my first several years. It didn't go on after that because I got into semiotics and other things in the philosophy of language and dialectical philosophy, and so I ended up leaving Wittgenstein behind. The first book that I ever read by Wittgenstein was neither the Tractatus nor the Philosophical Investigations, but instead it was his On Certainty, which was given to us as a reading for our contemporary philosophy class, which was a kind of weird class. It covered a bit of analytic philosophy, and Wittgenstein fit into that. It covered process philosophy, pragmatism, and existentialism. That was the field of contemporary philosophy where I went to undergraduate. They basically thought that philosophy had more or less come to a close by 1950 or 1955. So this is an interesting work, and I liked it quite a bit. I really enjoyed the approach that they were taking in it. He was interested in this question: what does it mean to be certain? Why are we driving after that? How do we use the language of certainty, belief, knowledge? And he was exploring avenues that I hadn't seen too many other people doing. So, for example, he says, "I know" seems to describe a state of affairs which guarantees what is known, guarantees it as a fact. Okay, so far so good, right? You get that out of many thinkers. And then he says, "One always forgets the expression, 'I thought I knew.'" So what we had here was a thinker who was very attentive to the ordinary context that oftentimes we would end up losing sight of, and thinking that it had something to do with the concepts that we were trying to explain. So I like that very much about Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is, in some ways, a pioneer in the philosophy of language, and he certainly had an important effect on Anglo-American philosophy, not so much on other domains. He really had practically no influence whatsoever on French philosophy, on German philosophy, on Italian philosophy. But he exerted a great influence in the Anglo-American world, which by that point had gotten itself into some dead ends, and he helped to get them out of those dead ends. Unfortunately, they were in those dead ends in large part because of rejecting the entire heritage of philosophy before them and managing to misunderstand most of that and to disparage it and leave it behind. So you know, the dead ends that he was getting them out of were things that they could have had other ways to get themselves out of. John Wisdom is a great example of somebody who actually did do that by looking at alternate sources and engaging them. But Wittgenstein is responsible for the turn to ordinary language and paying attention to the grammar, the logical grammar of our statements, our questions, our assertions, you know, talking about concepts, belief in a very pragmatic way as being this sort of network that we are involved with and sort of presuppose in order to make sense out of the things that we're talking about. Wittgenstein also had this very therapeutic conception of philosophy, which I don't actually enjoy much or I'll really say respect much or share, where the goal was to let the fly out of the fly bottle. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But in any case, Wittgenstein was certainly an important philosopher because he ended up influencing other people in the world of Anglo-American philosophy who ended up saying some interesting things as well. And I don't just mean people like you know, Ryle or Austin. I also have in mind people like Ambrose and Geach and people like that, who had somewhat of a better grounding in the classical tradition, in understanding of Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle. Now, it's interesting, Alistair McIntyre, in an interview that he gave in Kinesis, at one point is asked about Heidegger and says that he considers Heidegger to be important to learn because he led to so many mistakes, but that he's not a great philosopher in his own right, whereas Wittgenstein is. And I would actually say I think the reverse is true. But again, you know, he's coming out of that context, and I'm coming out of a very different context. I would say that Wittgenstein, when you plumb the depths of what he has to say, and then you compare it to what other people have to put on the table, turns out not to be quite so profound as we would imagine. But there is some real depth there. So, you know, just because you don't have, you know, the depth of Lake Michigan doesn't mean that you're not a Great Lake. And so Wittgenstein is a great philosopher. So what are some of the key things that I really enjoyed or found interesting or wanted to puzzle over in his work? So one of the biggest things is his notion that rules always involve some sort of interpretation. And digging into, well, how is it that we actually do interpret rules to make sense of them? Because there's a lot of things that by the mid-20th century people are considering to be just completely rule-bound activities, and therefore entirely unproblematic, like, for example, mathematics. The notion was if you can just have some sort of algorithmic formal system, then you can take all the subjectivity, all the uncertainty out of it. And Wittgenstein showed us that at least as far as human concerns are involved, and that pretty much includes everything in our world, everything that we sense, everything that we make sense out of, you can't eliminate that. And so it's very good to be attentive to that and to think about that and to try to see whether the way in which we make assumptions actually guides the way in which we follow rules, or the way in which we learn them, or the way in which we teach them, or the way in which we enforce them. He also had a great idea with this family resemblances business when it came to definitions. A lot of people want to try to define things by getting at the essence of the thing. And, you know, when Plato got us on the road to definitions, the horos being sort of a thing about it as a circle, everything that fits into that circle is that thing, and everything that's outside of that circle is not that thing. Everything within that circle has that essence, everything outside of the circle doesn't. And there are some things that we can define that way, but there are many other things that we can't similarly define. For example, the word freedom, right? freedom has multiple uses, and there were other ways to try to get at this. We could talk about analogical predication and even, you know, equivocity and things along those lines. But Wittgenstein had a nice idea in this family resemblance business, where he said, for some things, really, definition is much more like noting family resemblances. Everybody within the family has certain traits, but not everybody has the same traits. So there might be a certain nose that 9 out of 10 people in the family have, but the 10th person doesn't have. So it's not something that everybody has that makes it essential or at the core of it. It's rather that most of them have it in common. And then there could be a certain way in which the hair falls, right? The chin, you know. And so when it comes to defining things like freedom, that might be very useful. When it comes to defining religion, in philosophy of religion, a lot of people think that the only way we can adequately define it is by picking out certain traits and then doing a Wittgenstinian family resemblance. Same thing with in fascist studies or far-right studies with defining the actual notion of fascism. You know, everyone's trying to find the fascist minimum, but it's better to look at it in terms of family resemblance. So that's a very useful concept too. Guiding us to pay attention to our logical grammar and focusing on the usage, not the intention, but the usage of terms, of words, of whole, you know, bits of meaning, like propositions or statements or questions, and then looking at them in terms of something. Use leads us to something else, which is context. And Wittgenstein wasn't the kind of person who says, well, there's a whole bunch of different contexts and that's all there is to it. He brought out this notion of a language game. And this starts to bring together a lot of these notions, right? Because how do you know that something's a game? It has certain rules that people have to follow within it. And that structures what the game is. So, for example, chess consists in a chessboard and pieces, but also the rules that govern what you can do. And they make sense within that context. And you can expand it. So, for example, in Star Trek, you know, they came up with this 3D chess, right, that Spock would always be playing. And that's an extension of the notion of chess, which we're familiar with because of the language, as Wittgenstein, the language game and the practice of playing chess. And language games can be invented, they can be specific to a certain activity or practice, they can be quite broad. You know, maybe mathematics itself is a type of language game, or maybe it's composed of a number of different language games, but this is a very useful concept that Wittgenstein came up with. He never did manage to circumscribe and say exactly what a language game was, nor whether there could be games within games, nor how games necessarily connected up with each other. And he left it to that. He left that to Wittgenstinians to sort of think about, figure out. Language game was not the only conception of context that he worked with. Language games are grounded on what he called a form of life, a broader set of practices, concerns, activities, a community sometimes even, in which people lived out what language games allowed them to do, to conceptualize, to contest, to make sense of, to produce. And Wittgenstein also had this notion that if we dig down, you know, we can do certain levels of analysis. Eventually we hit bedrock and we can't get any further, and we just have a description. And that description may seem rather arbitrary to us from the outside, or even from the inside as we're exploring our own world, but that it has its own sort of internal logic to it. I also liked that Wittgenstein paid close attention to what language intersected with, like, for example, our feelings, and not just, you know, the classical passions like anger and sadness and all that, but our feeling of what it meant to be certain, or bewilderment, And I like that he paid attention to how it tied in with command and obedience and enforcement to some degree. I like that he was interested in how people came together in language games and how they might be, contesting things within language games. And so these were really interesting ideas, heady ideas for me. And I saw connections between these and some of the other concepts that I was playing with at the time, and learning about in other classes. And so I decided I was going to write my master's thesis originally on Wittgenstein. And a master's thesis is sort of like a small book. It could be as little as 60 pages. My master's thesis that I ended up writing on Husserl and de Saussure ended up being about 115 pages. And actually just replicating stuff that Derrida and Gramsci had already done, strangely enough. But I didn't realize at the time. Anyway, at first I wanted to write on Wittgenstein. And I was really interested in this notion of language game. And I wanted to explore something that seemed to be a big problem in Wittgenstein. A lot of Wittgenstinians would say, well, you just have a whole bunch of language games and they could be incommensurable with each other, and you move from one to the next, and there's really no stepping point. And I said, well, that doesn't actually make sense, because that's not what our life is like. And actually that doesn't fit Wittgenstein's profile either. And this is my favorite book by Wittgenstein, my all-time favorite. It always has been, and probably always will be. Remarks on the Foundation of Mathematics. And this is the really nice edition, which has the German and English facing pages. If you've watched my videos, I really love that sort of thing. And Wittgenstein realized that mathematics, there were two really key things. He realized that mathematics was something that was a very broad scope, that it's not as if we want to talk in terms of language games, there's only one, use of mathematics. No, there's multiple uses, and yet we have this same thing, mathematics, with a number system and the possibility of calculation running through all of them. So how is that capable, given Wittgenstein's, you might say, his metaphysics? Using a term that he's kind of allergic to, but he really does have a metaphysics. It's just one that's grounded in language and form of life and that sort of thing. The other thing was mathematics had been seen by the Enlightenment, really early modern philosophy, all the way through the Enlightenment to the Logicist Project, as being something at least that we can be certain about and attain some degree of exactitude and rigor within. All the other stuff is messy, but if we do things in a mathematical way, that will bear some results that we can really count on. And Wittgenstein said, well, no, it's not that simple. Let's actually look at what people do with mathematics and think about how mathematics really works, and look how mathematicians do things. And then we won't be quite so certain, because all the human elements will start to intrude. And I'm just going to read you two very short passages from this work. He has, a lot of very interesting things to say. He says, the propositions of logic are, quote, laws of thought, because they bring out the essence of human thinking. This is something that other people have said. Or, to put it more correctly, because they bring out or show the essence, the technique of thinking. They show what thinking is, and they also show kinds of thinking. Now, just a little bit earlier, he said, the laws of logic are indeed the expression of thinking habits, but also the habit of thinking. That is to say, they can be said to show how human being thinks, how human beings think, and also what human beings call thinking. So it's not like the laws of logic are just like out there in Never Land, and we come across, oh wow, now we can finally put everything into its place. There's something that we actually had some role in producing, and we are able to produce them like that because somebody else had us work on the sort of things that would have us, there's a whole backwards progression there. And they turn out, it's not as if they just, don't hold or anything like that, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than we originally thought, and they may not have the sort of scope that we assume them to, that we project them onto the world as having. Here's another interesting one. The philosopher must twist and turn about so as to pass by the mathematical problems and not run up against one, which would have to be solved before he could go further. His labor in philosophy is, as it were, an idleness in mathematics. It is not that a new building has to be erected or that a new bridge has to be built, but the geography as it now is has to be judged. So this notion of sort of getting the lay of the land, of figuring out how the streets actually run and what's going on when we're doing mathematics and when we're thinking mathematically and when we're extending mathematics and logic into all sorts of other areas. That's what that book was really about, and I found that fascinating. Now, I was not so interested just in the question of mathematics. I was interested in what is the nature of our language that we can actually conceptualize language game? What is the nature of a language game in which we can actually discuss language games? So there's some recursivity there, right? In which we can debate about it, we can contest about it. Is that rule governed, or is that anything goes when you get to this higher level? And does that higher level sometimes fall into the lower level? You know, one of the intuitions that I have, that I share with A.J. Grammas, is that there is no such thing as meta-language when you get down to it. Meta-language always ends up being, in some way, regular language, just, you know, working in a somewhat different way and having all the same features of language. And anyway, I started to try to write on this, and I was working with Donna Summerfield, who unfortunately died very, very early. She was a very promising Wittgenstein scholar that we had. She had cancer and passed away. God rest her soul. And she was a good mentor. I had taken her class on the history of analytic philosophy, and then I took her Wittgenstein class, and we talked about all these sorts of issues, and I said, I want to write on Wittgenstein. She said, okay, let's start meeting and talking about these things. And then I would start writing, and then she would say, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not seeing what you're seeing. This is not making sense to me. And I think a lot of that came because of the fact that she was analytically trained. She had studied under people who had studied under Wittgenstein, and she told some very interesting stories about them, because a lot of them picked up Wittgenstein's tics, and they would think that banging your head on the wall was somehow doing philosophy, or integral to the task. And she kind of pushed that aside, but she had a very difficult time seeing what I was trying to drive at, and I was having a difficult time as well articulating what I was driving at. So what ended up happening was, about halfway through the writing process, she ended up thankfully telling me, this is not going to work. I think that you need to find a new advisor, because I'm not able to really make sense out of what you're doing, and this is, you know, I'm not able to give you any sort of guidance, and frankly I don't know whether what you're doing is actually good work or not. So I ended up casting around, and at first, you know, there was a proposal that I should write it on Adorno, because I'd written a good paper on Adorno in a class, and I should expand that into a master's thesis. But I was really fascinated with language and with Wittgenstein, so I did stick with the philosophy of language business. Now, why did I end up getting away from Wittgenstein, and why do I infrequently read him? Well, there's a couple reasons. One is that this therapeutic conception of philosophy, that, you know, the goal of that philosophy is the disease of which it should be the cure, that the goal is to let the fly out of the fly bottle, you know, that we're supposed to show that traditional philosophical problems aren't really problems after all, and we're just sort of puzzling about nonsense. I don't buy any of that. I think that philosophy can be therapeutic, but when it is therapeutic, it doesn't do so by dissolving problems, usually. Or when it does that, it's because that's its beginning point. What it does is it contributes greater intelligibility to human existence and to the world that we live in and to social relations. And so it's actually not something that takes away. It's something that unveils, that shows us the way things actually are, or at least gets us closer to the way things actually are and lets us make the next step. So, you know, Wittgenstein's philosophy in a lot of respects stops itself short where it doesn't need to, and that's something that turns me off, I have to say. There's a sort of claustrophobic feeling to a lot of Wittgenstein's writing, in my view and in my experience of it. And I think that's in part because he's writing in an intellectually impoverished realm of Anglo-American philosophy, early 20th century, where they had, you know, we're going to wipe away all this and start anew, and we're going to just begin by paying very close attention to the things that we're doing. And they deprived themselves of the resources of the great traditions of philosophical inquiry. Many of them did, not all of them. John Wisdom didn't, Alice Ambrose didn't, but they were exceptions. And you get the idea that it's almost like what happened with communism. After the Velvet Revolution, people were like, well, what do we do now? Everything's been gutted. We have to rebuild from the ground up, but we don't have all the things that we would normally have. We don't have a rich, robust intellectual life because of the damage that these people, these Philistines, had done. And you know, it's one thing to tell yourself, oh, you know, the damage these people have done, and say, well, we'll just rebuild it, when you actually have the resources that you need. But Anglo-American philosophy, in many respects, deprived itself of resources. And they didn't need to, because there were people right down the street studying Aristotle who actually made sense of Aristotle because they took Aristotle seriously, you know, or pick whoever else you like. So that's something I don't like about Wittgenstein. And I think that Wittgenstein himself would have benefited by reading many more people and really taking them to heart and making sense of them. I mean, he mentions Augustine, but you don't get the sense that he actually understands much of Augustine, or thought a great deal about Augustine, and he would have benefited greatly by that. There's a whole bunch of things that you could say about that, where there just isn't enough engagement with the tradition there. And had there been more, he wouldn't have spent as much time in perplexity and reinventing wheels. Wittgenstein, because of that, doesn't really address many of the things that I'm particularly interested in when it comes to language and human beings. So, for example, you know, I would have loved to have seen Wittgenstein talk much more about emotions and the affective life and praxis and human beings, but he didn't do it. He didn't write an awful lot, you know, to begin with, but he, you might say he spent a lot of his time doing groundwork rather than actually exploring things more systematically. He could have been an Aristotle, but he wasn't. And that, you know, Aristotle was a dialectical philosopher. He read and knew what pretty much everybody else on the scene had done, and knew where he differed from them, and knew exactly why he had, and could tell you why he'd gone further. And Wittgenstein, I don't see him able to do that on a lot of key issues. You know, this notion of language game and form of life and rule and interpretation is really brilliant. I would have loved to have seen him talk more about the structures of authority within it, or how these things develop over time, historically. But he didn't do that. So, now, the other thing that I'll say is that when it comes to philosophy of language, Wittgenstein does make some contributions, and I've talked about them. But a great many other people do as well, and many of them are part of that tradition. So Aristotle is one of them. You can't do philosophy of language, in my view, effectively, if you don't at least know Aristotle. You should also know Thomas Aquinas, because he had a lot of great things to say about language. You should probably know Thomas Hobbes and his views on language. And when it comes to sort of contemporary analyses of what is going on in the interface between language or, signs and systems more broadly, and life, action, thought, being itself, there's a lot of other people who have much more, I think, to contribute, and much more straightforward, structured things. So Wittgenstein can be a very great clearing things away and getting us to pay attention, but to get beyond Wittgenstein, I think that we need to, read Heidegger, or we need to look at structural linguists like Grammas and Helmslev, and contemporary ones like Umberto Eco or John Deely, Thomas Seybach. I think that we ought to be attentive to all these sorts of things, and so I ended up seeing less and less to get out of Wittgenstein. I still enjoy reading him. I still enjoy teaching him, although I haven't done it for a while. And I will shoot those videos about some of his works later on, perhaps this fall. So that's been another one of my philosophical phases. Now you know a little bit more about my history, and I'll leave off there.